Alastair McIntosh is a great red-bearded Caledonian fountain of insight, passion, and action, all of it devoted to bringing the human presence into a proper relationship both with the natural world and with the ultimate mystery which his Presbyterian ancestors called God. McIntosh begins in the Hebrides, overturning Scotland's iniquitous feudal system of land tenure on the Isle of Eigg, which leads directly to the Land Reform Scotland Act of 2003. He ends up lecturing on subjects like the theology of land reform to such organizations as the Russian Academy of Sciences. Having defeated Lafarge Cement's bid to create a super quarry on the Hebridean Isle of Harris, he now sits on Lafarge's Sustainability Stakeholders Panel. A Quaker and a dedicated promoter of nonviolence, he lectures regularly to serving military and naval officers at Britain's Joint Services Command and Staff College. He devotes about a third of his time to community economic development in the former shipbuilding district of Govan in Glasgow, where he is treasurer of the Gale Trust and where he and his wife live. His efforts on land reform have resulted in community groups taking control of millions of acres of Scottish land, fully 2% of the country's landmass. The author of 4 highly influential books, he has taught at several universities in Scotland and Ireland, focusing on human ecology and on the spiritual basis of deep activism for social and environmental change. Though he is much in demand as a speaker, he restricts his travel to reduce his carbon footprint. But in 2012, he came to Nova Scotia to present a workshop on spiritual activism at the Tatamagouche Centre. I spoke with him there. Tell me about Eigg and what happened in Eigg.
Well, I have to go back a little bit to do that because I was raised on the nearby island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. And when I was 22 in 1977, after graduating from Aberdeen University, I went with voluntary service overseas, the equivalent of your CUSO, out to Papua New Guinea. And when I was there, I became aware of the importance of land tenure. And I got back to Scotland and found that whereas Papua New Guineans owned their land, we were not in control of our land. And around that time, I was approached by a crofter called Tom Forsyth, a small-scale agriculturalist called Tom Forsyth, who was wanting to kind of start a revolution on the island of Eigg by proposing an Isle of Eigg trust, which would bring Eigg into community land ownership. So he asked me if I would become involved in that. We launched the trust in 1991, and after a long battle, in June 1997, the island came into community land ownership.
Now, what ownership was it in the first place?
Oh, feudal tenure, owned by a wealthy businessman, Keith Schellenberg, who used it as his holiday playground, and had, he had a sort of kind of aristocratic concern for the islanders, but very patronizing and not in a way that liberated their energies, such as has happened since then.
I think this is a hard thing probably for people like Canadians to grasp, that the whole island belongs to the one man.
To one man.
And everybody on it is tenants.
Yeah.
And are there more or less at his pleasure.
But you see, that is Scottish feudalism for you, as was until very recently when they removed the feudal laws. That is why so many Scots are in places like Canada, because when the landlords saw that they could make more money by turning the land over to sheep or to deer hunting estates, they kicked the people off, and so they came over to places like Canada, where the cycle of oppression repeated. The oppressed became oppressor very often, pushing native peoples here, pushing First Nations people here off their land. And this is part of the colonial mentality that we really now have to get a grip of in one world and shake ourselves up and decolonize our own minds.
I know enough about Scottish history to remember Culloden
Yes.
and the clearances, but somehow it hadn't occurred to me that the end result of that was that to this day, those are still great feudal estates. They never
Yes.
did get broken down into any kind of other ownership.
Well, you see, you're a Cameron, I'm a McIntosh. Traditionally, the clan chief was not a landowner. I would say the clan chief was a landholder, holding it on behalf of the clan. Donald, if you look at the bardic poetry, it speaks of the clan chief as being the highest apple on the tree, but the trees of the whole people. The place was for the benefit of the people. Now, what happened with Culloden is that you had this process by which the Highlands was increasingly colonized by, I don't like to say the English or even the Lowland Scots, because it was bigger than that. It was the spirit of modernity that was colonizing it. The spirit that changed things from an ancient way of being a people in connection with the land to a commodification of people and the land. And that spirit colonized things, and the last stand of the Highlanders was the Battle of Culloden in 1746, following the Jacobite uprising of 1745, the 45 uprising, or rebellion, as our oppressors like to call it. And so today, you know, when people say what's wrong with aspects of Scottish life, they will often say it all goes back to Culloden, because after Culloden, the Highland troops were massacred. There were reprisals taken out across Highland villages. Battalions of English soldiers were put into villages to root out Catholic priests, to search for arms, and people weren't allowed to wear the traditional dress or to carry a sword or anything like that, the acts of prescription. And so the culture was broken, and unless the clans agreed to go along with the New World Order, well, you know what happened to the MacDonalds of Glencoe? They were massacred because they failed to sign William of Orange's orders that they had to show allegiance to the British state. So this was in the backdrop of our history, and clan chiefs who didn't go along with it had their land taken off them. The land would be given or sold on to others who would be obliging. And so the process came about by which people became to be seen of nothing more than a nuisance value, to be cleared off the land, to be pushed into the cities as cannon fodder for the Industrial Revolution, and remaining as our urban poor today, or pushed off to Australia or to Canada or South Africa to become part of that whole colonial enterprise that was the British Empire.
So what happens on Eigg is the first real crack in that land tenure thing, and then that leads on to a Scottish Act of Parliament in 2003, which does what? Which extends the capacity for this?
Yes, I mean, Eigg wasn't quite the first. There had been other land revolts before, which led to the passing of the Crofting Act in 1886, which gave security of tenure in areas that were designated for crofting, for peasant agriculture in effect. But Eigg was certainly the first of the modern land reform movements, with us founding the Trust in 1991. And basically what we did was we challenged that structure of power. You see, when people have lived with an oppressive structure of power for a long time, they internalize the oppression. They take it into themselves. They sort of tug a lock to the landowner and accept that that's just the way the world is. Now, I mean, over here, you've all been very influenced by the work of Moses Cody back in the 1930s and so on. And what he was saying is you have to break through that. You have to make people masters of their own destiny. And you can only do that if you give them a vision. I talk about the importance of remembering that which has been dismembered. In other words, reclaiming what has happened in our psychological history, our psychohistory. And then revisioning, seeing how it could be if you were to order your society in a different way. And only then can you come to the third stage of reclaiming, claiming back the power, the empowerment, the connection with place that is necessary to become fully human once again.
And in the revisioning, you talk about the three-way human ecological relationship between community, nature, and the inner self of each person.
Yes. You see, I think when we talk about community today, we too often have a very shriveled and shrunken understanding of what community can actually be. And we confuse community with society. Society is only one aspect of community. And so I see it as having three faces, Satish Kumar of the Schumacher College refers to it conveniently as soil, soul, and society. Soil, community with the earth, with the land. Soul, community within ourselves, the inner life, and ultimately, if you believe in spiritual reality, our connection to God, to the Great Spirit. And society, community with one another. And so the fullness of community is this whole relationship with what life is about.
And that would also be the essence of human ecology, right? Which is your academic specialty.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm still a visiting professor of human ecology at Strathclyde University and a fellow of our Centre for Human Ecology in Scotland. Now, human ecology is the relationship between people and the environment. It's often defined as a coming together of the social environment and the natural environment, although I would add also the spiritual environment that underpins the whole shebang.
Which brings me to ask about the course you're doing here in Tatamagouche, which is a course in spiritual activism.
Yes,
Tell me
I'm
what
here
that
in
is.
Canada just now to teach a course on what I call spiritual activism. And this is something that I've taught as an accredited course in both Strathclyde University in Glasgow and in the Open University. And it's basically what I was doing in Edinburgh University before that as well. Now, basically, Donald, we're living in a world where people who are called to be activists, and by an activist I mean simply to be active in life, to be engaged, to be fully alive, to be caring about your community and one another. And when you get called to environmental and or social activism, to stand up and stand out for a cause, it's often very costly, especially when you're in it for the long run, when you give your life to working for justice. And the costliness of that, because so often you're dealing with failure and with woundedness and low pay and long hours and all the rest of it, leads many activists to either, in the end, selling out or burning out. So you get a lot who just go off and work for the corporations, or they burn out and become depressed, and it's not a nice scene. So the question that I've got is, how do we sustain this kind of work for the long term? And I think that's where we've got to drill our wells down very deep. And we'll basically sometimes find ourselves thrown back. You know, even non-believers get thrown back onto the questions of spirituality. Is there a deeper meaning in this life to just me as my ego on legs? Are we ultimately, at some very deep level, members one of another, as St. Paul put it? Are we interconnected? Or as the Hindus put it, you know, is Atman, the individual soul, ultimately a part of Brahman, the universal soul? Or the Muslims say that all Muslims are as one body. Is there this sense of profound interconnection between us, like here's you, this fingernail, here's me, the next one, the producer, the next one, and so on. And we can think of ourselves as just little egos in our own little bubble, or we can see that ultimately we are profoundly connected, and that the bedrock of that connection is what you might call God, or the Great Spirit, or the Goddess, whatever name you choose for that. Jesus talked about us all being branches on the vine of life, on the tree of life. So that's kind of the model that I see of it. And the question is, when we are engaged in activism for the long term, what spiritual resources, things like discernment, using meetings for clearness, inner seeing and being, some would use the word prayer or meditation for these kind of things, what can we use to help us stay fast and neither burn out nor sell out in our work?
And what are so the practices that would lead to that would be things that would traditionally be seen as things like meditation and prayer and so forth?
That's part of it. For my work, I make a lot of use of the word discernment. Now, the word discernment, it's used by us Quakers to a very great extent. I was raised a Presbyterian and I still draw heavily on that tradition, but by choice I became a Quaker because of the commitment to non-violence that you find there. And Quaker approach to life is strongly based on discernment of the inner spirit of what is going on. The Jesuits also teach the same thing with their Ignatian exercises, where they say that the word discernment means to separate out from, to sift, as if you're sifting the gold from the dust. And so I think that in doing activist work, you need to be very careful that you're not doing it from an ego level, and certainly not from a projection of your psychological problems out onto the world. You know, there's a huge tendency in many young activists to basically project their trouble with their father or some authority figure out onto the corporation or the government or what have you. I remember seeing one cartoon of all the activists going past, and they've all got their placards: save the whale, ban the bomb, down with the corporations, screw the government, and the very last guy has one saying, I hate my dad. Now, we have to be careful, because that's often a part of our activism when we get going, because we're working out our own issues in our lives. But it's not good enough. We've got to push deeper. We've got to work through those personal psychological issues, and we've got to tap in to the deep discernment of what life is calling us to do. How can we build a world that respects this environment and respects the needs that people have for a dignified standard of living, but not for an excessive living? Sufficiency, but not surplus. That's the kind of world we need to discern and remember, revision, and reclaim.
And what you're looking for, or what your students are looking for, I presume, is a way to anchor themselves so that they are steady in that quest.
That's it.
And give what they can give, and
that's it.
And know what that is.
That's it, you see, Donald. And when you give yourself to a cause, to a just cause, when you make a commitment to fight for something you believe in, and I use the word fight, I mean, it can be a very non-obvious form of fighting. It can be like, standing by a village shop to keep it going. It can be helping somebody who's illiterate to find expression. When you give yourself to something, or working with disabled people, when you give yourself to something like that, you need to, I think, shift from looking for your reward in an outward sense, just in terms of money and approval and so on, to finding your fulfillment from an inner sense. That ultimately, if I might put it in my own words, ultimately we are the hands and feet of God on this earth. We are the hands and feet of the divine. And the more we come to understand our service in that context, the more deeply we connect with that divine spirit, and the more clearly our light starts to burn. So the chances of us burning out or selling out becomes increasingly reduced the further we go along that spiritual path.
I'm struck by the fact that you see the whole thing as spiritual, and many activists would not. Many activists would, in fact, have pretty deep grudges about where the churches have stood and where indeed the Bible has stood on a lot of this.
Well,
but you talk about being called to activism, which is really a religious way of phrasing it, isn't it?
Yes, but you see, so often the religions are the problem. I mean, look at the child abuse dynamics that you've had with religion in this country. Look at some of the pernicious teachings that can be expressed through some religions. I think we need to distinguish between spirituality, which is the direct connection with the divine root of our being, and religions, which are the social expression and political expression of that spirituality. Now, the interesting thing about spirituality is it's something that we do partly individually, partly by going off into the forest or going into meditation or prayer or whatever, all on our own. But also we do it collectively together. We do it individually and collectively. Jesus said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, then I am there also. We need to do both those things. We need to have our separate spirituality, our spiritual core, but also it is necessary to have it organized in a social form, because whenever 2 or 3 come together, we've kind of got to agree what is it that we are here for. So I think that having churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, whatever your religion might be, is very important, but it is vital that it keeps on being resourced from the wellsprings of spiritual life. And there may be times when we have to break away from the traditions we have been raised in and stand apart, but maybe then at some time come back in. You know, I'm having more and more to do just now with the Presbyterian tradition of my upbringing, because partly I'm being called back towards that, but also I see the importance of having stood back and then stepping back forward again and speaking into it. And this is beautiful work.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I'm interested that you find, because Presbyterianism is in my background too, it's a pretty stern form of religion. It's one from which many of us, I think, escape with gratitude.
Yeah.
Feeling fundamentally that life is not as stern as that the world is not as nasty as the Presbyterians tend to.
You see, I've been studying this. I'm writing a book just now which is about this kind of stuff, and I've been asking the question, how come our people in the Hebrides became not just Presbyterian, but what many would call hyper-Calvinist, the full 5-point Calvinism, which includes the total depravity of every part of what a human being is, and limited atonement, the idea that Christ only died for the elect and not for the damned, and the idea that God, before the foundations of time were set, divided humankind into the elect and the damned. And of course, the holy like to think of themselves as being in the elect and everybody else is damned. It's a very pernicious doctrine, in my opinion. The question is, if you go along to, for example, the Free Church on my island, in the Isle of Lewis, you will meet the most wonderful people. And so the spirituality is very deep, but the religious crust of it is, in my view, needs to review itself. And I've been looking at where this came from. And of course, Calvinism and its Scottish expressions were coming out of huge violent struggles that were happening in religion in that time in late medieval, early modern Europe. And all of that violence is mixed in with it. And I think, in a sense, we need to purify it. And what Spurgeon, the great Presbyterian preacher, once said is that the essence of, he said the essence of Calvinism is that salvation is of the Lord. Now, that wouldn't be quite my language. It's not my way of speaking, that evangelical way. But basically what they are saying and what they are believing is that the whole shebang that we are about comes out of divine grace. Everything is coming out of divine providence. And that's actually a very beautiful way of coming to see and to know reality. So what I'm trying to do is to work with that kind of a core, but also to challenge the stuff like the elect and the damned and so on, and to say, is this really becoming? Is this can be one interpretation of the Bible, I agree. But for every scripture proof you throw at me about that Calvinistic interpretation of things, I can throw to you a whole lot of other scripture proofs, like from the Epistle of James at the end of the Gospels and so on, or the teachings of Jesus direct, which would counter that. So this is where we need discernment. Jesus never said, I'm going to leave you St. Paul. He didn't even say, I'm going to leave you the Gospels. But if we go on what he says in John's Gospel, he did say, I'm going to leave you the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete. I'm going to leave you the sense of divine inspiration, which you can discern individually and collectively to guide your way. I find that a very powerful teaching.
Well, it's very interesting going back to the root in that kind of way. I love your word, the crust, for all of those teachings which you and I think agree are maybe a wrong turn on the road, or not a very happy part of it.
Yeah.
Now, when you talked about fight, I thought to myself, you fight in some very interesting ways, and in some ways that are quite surprising. For example, speaking to organizations that would seem to be antithetical to most of what you stand for. You lecture at military colleges, you sit on the sustainability board of Lafarge Cement, which was your adversary in the Isle of Harris, right? How does that work, and what's that experience like?
Well, this is where the whole sense of discernment and discerning your calling, your vocation, you know, the word vocation from vocal to hear a voice, to feel a calling, becomes so important because it leads you into strange spaces. So on the one hand, I've been arrested by the police for having been blocking the gate at the Faslane nuclear submarine base in Scotland. On the other hand, every year for the past 15 years, I've been invited to speak on the Advanced Command and Staff course to some 300 or 400 military officers, including Canadians, in the Military Staff College in England, about non-violence. Now, this is the amazing thing. I was down there just a month ago, and the military are very open to hearing about non-violence because they are observing what's been happening in Burma. They're observing what's been going on in Egypt. They're seeing all of these things, as well as way back to Gandhi and what have you in Indian independence. And they're recognizing that if their real concern is with security and peace, throwing bombs at people isn't necessarily the best way to do it. When they invited me a month ago, their letter requesting me was, we want you to talk about approaches to security in situations where military forces have not been able to contain the violence. Now, I find this very wonderful because many of us in the peace movement, we presume that all the generals and so on are just bloodthirsty, violent thugs. And in my experience, very, very few are like that, and the ones that are misselects. That the vast majority of the military are very conscientious people. And these days, having seen what's been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of them have seen violence, they've seen the blood and guts, they've seen the innocent carnage that is caused, and their stomachs have been turned by it. And they are deeply looking for other ways in which peace can be brought to the world. So that's the kind of work I do with the military, trying to open up those channels of awareness.
That's a remarkable, it's remarkable that they should invite you, but when you explain it, not quite so remarkable that you should have something real to offer them. But that whole question of security, if the military see themselves as basically those who are responsible for the security of a community, right, it can lead them in all kinds of interesting directions that have nothing much to do with the traditional roles of, you know.
That's what I try to say to them. I try to say to them, look, you've got a whole universe. I mean, the Joint Services Command and Staff College, where I do this, is basically a university of war. And I say to them, you know, you yourselves, many of you will admit that war is not working as a tool of foreign policy. So how about trying peace? You know, if security is our aim, if peace is our aim, if we believe that it is about justice, and they talk a lot about just war, then how about really studying how you bring about peace? How about understanding what Gandhi called it satyagraha, which means truth force, or soul force, or God force? How about understanding how it is that the application of that, and of citizens learning to use that, can bring about revolutions without blood being shed? Where do your values really stand? Do you just want to go and shoot guns and kill people, or do you want to bring peace and love in the world? And you know, the vast majority of the ones I speak to at any rate are good people. You know, they've got good hearts, they've got courageous hearts. I'm impressed by many of the military who I've met. And they want to be on the right side of things. It's just that their thinking has too often been about using violence. And so I say to you, I don't think I can go along and make them all throw down their guns and become pacifists overnight. But I say to them, just consider studying peace, reading some of the very good books that are out there about non-violence, and considering that as a possible way forward.
It must be quite startling for a military officer to confront a situation in which the force he represents is defeated by the kind of force that you're describing. I mean, at the end of the day, the British Army could not stop Indian independence. They could not beat Gandhi,
No.
right? And so it must be, if you think about that in terms of victory and defeat, to be defeated by something which is so completely outside the realm in which they're expert, must be a very startling thing.
It's quite a shocking thing, and you see, the mentality of the colonizer. And we've got to remember, I mean, Canada was part of the British Empire, on which they said the sun never set because it went right around the world, so the sun was always shining on the British Empire, the greatest empire, or should I say the biggest empire. I don't believe it was great, that the world has ever seen. Canada was very much a part of that.
The senior
and
dominion.
the trouble is, when you're the colonizer, you believe that you are standing for something that is right and good because you have diminished the colonized. You believe that the Mi'kmaq have got nothing to teach us about being human, when in fact it's precisely by sitting down and listening to the Mi'kmaq or the Indians or whatever that we will complete the fullness of our humanity. And so that is a huge challenge to the ego, but it is an open door to the soul. And so that's why I see this as spiritual work. It's about shifting from an egocentric, narcissistic consciousness, which colonization is, and the presumption to rule the world that Britain and America have tended to have in recent years. Stepping back from that and stepping into the soul and realizing that every human being on this earth, and especially indigenous peoples, disabled peoples, people who we have marginalized in our presumption of superiority, that these are the people who can be our teachers in opening our hearts and drawing out our humanity.
I'm surprised, given that perspective and given what you've said about the British Empire, that you quote Kipling quite often in your work. You quote a huge range of people, but I was sort of surprised to find Kipling among them. What is it that appeals to you about Kipling?
You've got to remember that Kipling's mother was a MacDonald. She was one of us, Donald. And you know, when you read Kipling, there's two sides to him. On the one side, he's an apologist for the empire. On another side, he understands oppressed people, and they're both there. Now, I think that very often when you're dealing with an oppressor, it's helpful to take the oppressor's own writings and turn it round on them. Bring out the contradictions, open doors that they hadn't realized were there.
It was just an interesting little side point as I went through there. I found you even quoting If, which has got to be as much a Victorian sturdy anthem as there is, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hell and High Water is fundamentally a book about hope and moral behavior in the face of a huge and multifaceted threat to human persistence, I guess. Right? Is that a fair description for?
Yeah, you see.
Right? And you start out by taking aim at a sort of a bogus hope. You say, amongst environmental organizations, there's a kind of unwritten pact that we all have to stay optimistic. And you comment that this panders to appearances but buys into the lie.
Yes.
Tell me about the environmental organizations and that.
Okay, well, I was asked to write Hell and High Water as a summary of climate change science. It shouldn't, by the way, don't confuse it with another book of the same name by Joseph Romm, which is also a very good book about climate change. And I said to my publisher, you know, I'm not really interested in just repeating the science of climate change. I'm interested in getting at what's deep beneath us, because I'm concerned that we are living something of a lie in the environmental movement. I mean, this was back in 2007 when I was working on developing this book. I was concerned that many environmentalists were believing that by tweaking this and that and putting a solar gizmo on the roof, we could solve our problems, whereas when I looked at how the sums added up, we are so colossally complicit in energy consumption from non-sustainable sources in the developed world that we could not change what we are doing without an upheaval that would almost certainly be totally politically unacceptable to all but perhaps about 5% of the people. Now, this is a profoundly depressing scenario, because what it's saying is that we might be able to cut our carbon emissions, and that's why I'm involved with a company like Lafarge, unpaid I should say. I don't take their money at all, but I do advise them on issues like reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. That's important that we try to do what we can to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but if we think we're going to stop the global warming that is already coming on and the climate change we are already seeing quite radical signs of, then we are probably kidding ourselves if the mainstream science of climate change is correct. And I believe it probably is correct, that these scientists are not fools. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us without very much cause for optimism. And so when we try to pretend optimism, like many environmentalists have done, we're actually living a lie and setting ourselves up for failure. And my feeling is that we have to renounce the optimism, but never let go of hope. And what I mean by hope is a deep connection to what human life and other life on this planet is about, which may suffer and will suffer and is already suffering, where people are feeling the consequences of climate change and the poverty that it brings on. But nevertheless, there is a silver thread in there that if we hold on to, can pull our consciousness through and expand our understanding of what it really means to be a human being in unfolding consciousness on this earth. So that's what I'm working on. It's really the spirituality of these modern times we're living in.
Yeah, and in a sense, you've sort of said, as I go through the book, what I find myself saying is you're saying, what is the real problem? What is the real problem? The real problem, is not technical. The real problem is, tell me about the real problem.
It's not technical, or should I say, we are not going to solve the real problem by technical measures or economics or politics alone. Those things are all important, but they're not the real problem. The real problem, in my analysis, is that we have created a society where we seek our fundamental consumption through consuming things, by having in order to be, instead of tapping into the authentic roots of being in the inner and spiritual life and what that means for our relationships and community. And so we have created consumerism. And one of the things I'm doing in Hell and High Water is I present the findings of many years' research I've done into the creation of consumerism. That consumerism was largely created after both the First and the Second World War by men like Eddie Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and Ernest Dichter, the father of modern advertising, as he liked to call himself, the father of motivational manipulation, I would say. And what these people were doing is that they were saying, look, we've had two big wars. We've had two great wars, the First and the Second World Wars, and those wars were good for business. And in order to keep business going in the post-war era, we need to create consumerism so that people start buying things they never knew they needed. We need to create wants and not just satisfy needs. Now that's the fundamental distinction. Once you start creating wants, then you create consumerism. And the way they did it was like they said, the human being is motivated, the buying behavior is motivated by all kinds of emotions like fear, love, guilt, sex, hate, pride, etc. And it's like, as advertisers, we need to bait the fishing hook and drop the bait into the unconscious psyche and hook the buying behavior, trigger that buying behavior, and then normalize that in society. So we now have a normalized situation. I mean, my wife ironed this shirt for me yesterday for appearing on your show, Donald. Because if I appeared in a crumpled shirt out of my rucksack, then it might not have been seen as being respectful on your show. And part of me rankles against that because energy was used to iron that shirt. In fact, I said to her, I should be doing that to myself. And she said, well, I'm going to do it for you because you won't do it otherwise, because I don't believe in using energy for that kind of thing. But that's an example of what I mean, of a social norm being created that we then all have to buy into, otherwise we come out as being abnormal. And yet it means more and more energy consumption, and that start destroying the earth.
You talk about cognitive polyphagia.
Goodness me.
It's a whopper of a phrase, but it describes something real and important that I think you're partially talking about right there.
Well, that was somebody's term. A better known term might be cognitive dissonance. It was somebody's term that I referred to in the book, and it's basically the ability to live in different compartments of our lives at the same time. You see, Donald, we're all complicit in the way the world is. We're all contradicted. After I played a key role in kicking out Lafarge from doing a super quarry on the island of Hubris in Scotland, they came back to me and they said, well, Alistair, do you use quarry products? Do you walk on roads? Do you have a roof over your head? Is there cement in your house? I said, yes. So they said, well, in that case, will you come on our sustainability panel and advise us how to do it in less damaging ways, because we are all complicit, you see? Now, normally what people do is they compartmentalize. So you will see a lot of environmentalists, for example, who hate the corporations, and yet you look at what they're wearing, you look at the labels on their clothes, you look at what they're driving or what they're eating, and it's coming from the corporations. And the corporations are doing it in a cutthroat manner, because when we go to the shops, we're always looking for the best deal. We might sometimes buy fair trade chocolate, but mostly we're always looking for the best deal. And so the corporate behavior is not just coming from corporate greed, but it's also a reflection of our own greed. So the polyphasia, as this person called it, or the cognitive dissonance, is the ability to compartmentalize those things. So on the one hand, I hate the corporations, but I see no contradiction in wearing their corporate labels or whatever it might be. And I'm kind of saying this isn't good enough, because it's not honest. And that we're only going to change the corporations, and we're only going to change the governments, if we fully own our part in that process and say we are all complicit, we are all corrupted. I mean, the Calvinists have got it right here. You know, there's a certain truth in their total depravity. We've got to admit, we've got to confess to that complicity, and only when we can see clearly, because we have done that, can we then start saying, how do we do it better? How do we learn to live differently?
Hubris is a big term in this book. Mm. And in hubris you see violence embedded deeply.
Yes.
This starts to get close to the sorts of issues that we will experience as we start to look at the cognitive dissonance and try and do away with it, yes?
Oh. You see, the Greek word hubris, or the word hubris comes from the Greek hybris, which means excessive pride, but it also means violence. And so the Greeks had this understanding that excessive pride requires violence in order to sustain itself. It requires, I mean, what is violence? The roots of violence is when I separate myself off from you, when I stand apart, when I put a castle wall around my life and keep you out, except insofar as you're willing to, or made to serve me. That's the roots of feudalism, it's the roots of violence. The whole thing's connected. Now, that's only possible when I think of myself as a better human being than you are. You know, because I'm white, because I'm male, because I've got blue eyes. I mean, Hitler saw it all. I'm superior to the person who's black or a woman or a Mi'kmaq or something like that. And I can only hold that together by the violence which then expresses as racism, as sexism, as colonialism. And that's my hubris, my cultural hubris, individually and culturally. Now, if we are going to humanize, if we are going to become, as Moses Coady said, masters of our own destiny, based on ways of living together that are not about competitive exploitation, but are about cooperative mutuality, we have to tackle those roots of pride in ourselves. And I believe we can only do that, and this is where, not just the Calvinists, not just the Presbyterians, but also, I think, all great faiths, your Catholic, your Jesuit exercises are very strong in this, about dissolving that hard crust of pride around us. I've been reading a lot of Russian Orthodox theology recently, and they've got a most wonderful take on hell, very different from the kind of eternal burning fire that I was raised on idea of it. But their idea of hell, and I love this kind of thing of the metaphor, the kind of true story, is that hell is a fire of love that burns off the incrustations of ego that prevent us from being authentically ourselves. And so when Jesus says something like, I come to bring fire to the earth and wish that it was already kindled, people generally read that as a hell and damnation passage, as if he's bringing hellfire. But think of it, if he's meaning the fire of love, which he almost certainly is, I come to bring fire to the earth, I come to bring love to the earth, and wish that the fire of love in the human heart was already kindled. Wow! That's the kind of religion I want.
And that sense of burning off the dross is...
Burning off the dross.
Yeah.
Burning off what's not us. Our hubris, our pride, our egotism is the false self. Ronnie Lang, the great Glasgow psychotherapist, he said the root of mental illness, in a sweeping generalization that I find to be fabulously true in many situations, is that we basically have an authentic self which should interact with the wider circle of the world. But so often we encircle that authentic self with an inauthentic self, which is how we want ourselves to be seen. I don't want to be seen as somebody who's greedy and is, eats too much meat, that's one of my sins, and all the rest of it. Sometimes speeds when I think I'm not going to be caught on the road by a police car, even though that's burning too much carbon and putting people at danger. I don't want to be known by your listeners like that, Donald. I want them to think of me as a very pure, idealistic, perfect person. And so my inauthentic self would be projecting out that pure image, which of course sets myself up for failure. It's just not true. I'm actually a real person. I sometimes enjoy a little too much beer and all the rest of it. I'm a real person. I've got quite an eye for the ladies, and I don't go chasing after them, but I love my wife so much. But that's all in me, Donald. I'm a normal guy. Now, if I presented something otherwise, if I was presenting a false image of myself, and maybe I am, because we all do this to an unconscious extent, then I'm putting in investment into a false self. And Ronnie Lang said that what happens when you get mental illness is that all the energy shifts from that authentic self into the false self, often because there's been some kind of damage in childhood, which has damaged the development of the authentic self. And the trouble with the false self is it draws energy from the authentic self, and so the authentic self becomes more and more dead, which is why people who have been very broken in life may commit suicide, because they feel they're already dead. And so in addressing the hubris of the false self, we have to call back living from our true selves, even though it might be very shriveled and shrunk. That's a very humbling process, but it's where you get the divine help. That's where the, what the Calvinists call the irresistible grace comes from. That's a wonderful thing, because what the spiritual life in many traditions is saying is we are not in this on our own, but we will receive help from other human beings around us, and we will receive help from the divine source if we confess the way we are and ask to be helped spiritually. People often say, how do I start? I don't believe in any spiritual life, although I would like to. I don't believe in God, but I miss him, as somebody put it, or I miss her. Well, if that's the case, how about trying living as if? Do an experiment. Live as if that spiritual reality is for real, and if you like, put out your prayer, if we must use that word. If there is a God, help me and show me. See what happens.
And what does happen?
Usually not much. Because you need patience. We have a long life. This is lifelong work. I would say you have to walk the path before you start seeing the path you are walking. And that's where faith comes in. Faith is the courage to take the step as if that path exists. Let me give you an example. Imagine you are quite a wealthy, we've all got a measure of wealth, or the ability to give service. You have the option of offering that or not offering it. And you kind of think, well, if I offer it, supposing I'm wealthy, if I start offering my wealth, if I start giving it away, not in a controlling mechanism, but in a way to bring glory on myself, but just quietly letting it slip away. The fear of the inauthentic self is that I'm going to lose power and I'll become a nobody. That's your fear. Well, try it. See what happens. And of course, what happens is you start finding wellsprings of life unblocking you. Because you're no longer seeing the world through the lens of your dollars. You start seeing the world through authentic human relationship. And then the magic of love starts kicking in. This is why a lot of people work with handicapped people, because the magic of love starts kicking in. When you do work with race relations, what happens as a white person when you first confront black people? They'll give you a mouthful. I've had it. They'll tell you what they think of you. And if you can stand there and receive that with a humility of understanding where it comes from, in my experience, they'll then pat you on the back and say, come and have a beer, come and have a cup of tea, come and talk. And then community starts building. And then you realize there's a deeper magic. C.S. Lewis talked about the deep magic set in place when time began, or words to that effect. There is a magic of human love which comes from somewhere beyond ourselves. And I see that as being the divine hand. And the more you go into that, the more you give to that, the more it opens up to you. And that's a spiritual path. In a way, in a funny way, the deeper you go in the spiritual path, the less faith you need, because it just becomes manifest.
Yeah, as you talk, I think to myself, you have an understanding of the divine that's very different from what most people mean when they talk about it. You see it infusing human life, or possibly infusing human life for those who are willing to.
Oh goodness, yes. But you see, read the Gospels of Jesus. Don't bother with the heavy theology of Paul, or if I speak from a Christian point of view, leave aside for the time being the Old Testament. It's important. These things, Paul and the Old Testament, are important, but just start with the Gospel. Start with something like Luke or Mark's Gospel, I would recommend. And you will see that infusion through there. Or read the Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism. Or read the Sufi writers. You get a good anthology of Sufism from the Islamic tradition. Talk to the Native Americans, the First Nations, about their indigenous wisdom, and say to them, look, I'm not indigenous to this place, but might it be possible that I could become so? You can't become native to a place if you're not born there, but perhaps we can all become indigenous if we learn that humility of submitting ourselves, or surrendering. I would prefer to use the word surrender. If you submit, you go under. But if you surrender, you yield unto. And the word surrender, sir, means to go over. There is a kind of going higher in order to yield. You surrender yourself to a place and its peoples, and you become absorbed into that, and you reground in what it means to be indigenous. And all I would say is that what happens then is that the inner sources of life start moving through you. And that's how you rekindle community.
You have a lovely little poem about exactly this point, about coming to a place willing to cherish and be cherished by the people. I haven't got it quite right, but that, you know.
It's a poem I call Scotland, because I thought about it in terms of Scottish indigenous identity, but it could apply anywhere. And if I remember, it's a person belongs inasmuch as they are willing to cherish and be cherished by this place and its peoples. A person belongs inasmuch as they are willing to cherish and be cherished by this place or by our place and its peoples, peoples plural, the many peoples, and putting place before peoples, getting the order of things right. We are an animal living on this earth, part of this creation. Let's not forget to reverence this earth on which we stand.
It works just as well in New Scotland as Old Scotland.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. It works just as well in New Scotland as in Old Scotland.
It works just as well in New Scotland and in Old Scotland. And the irony is that in New Scotland, because you've got such an ethnic mix, and because of the history here, and the Mi'kmaq are still here, people of white Scots origins or other origins have got a good opportunity to learn it, but it is a lesson that we need equally back in Old Scotland as well, to reground ourselves from the damage that history and violence has done to us.
This will seem, it will seem, I think, to some people watching this as though we've gone a long way away from the environment, but I think we're getting quite close to, well, what's the source of real hope then, having had this discussion? We've been talking in a sense about the diagnosis, but what's the source of real hope, to close the circle on that inauthentic hope that we began with?
I think the source of real hope is the understanding that the whole thing, the whole environment, the whole of humanity is ultimately the dance of the divine working itself out in the opening up of the flower of consciousness. That's the really big picture. That as Homo sapiens sapiens, we have only been on this planet for 200,000 years. We've only had advanced religions for 1% of that time. There's maybe another 2 or 3 billion years before the earth, as Rabbi Burns puts it, melts with the sun, as the sun moves into a red dwarf. There is a long-term future on this planet, Donald, and the hope is that we gradually, with much suffering along the way, and yet the suffering itself is a tool that opens consciousness and opens the doors of love. The hope is that come what may in the come to pass, we will deepen our humanity. And the work of our times is to go with the flow of what is happening and learn those skills, make that commitment, ask for that inner help in order to take whatever is happening in the world, whether it's climate change or poverty or disease or whatever, war or whatever it might be, and use those things not to drive us into a corner of fear, but to open the doors of love.
You say, how difficult it is to communicate the sheer wonder of what is potentially open to us.
You see, we're talking here about the power of beauty. We're talking about testing our actions and how we live in life by the standards of beauty. And beauty is not something we can control. Beauty is something that emerges out of the mystery. Beauty is about saying that our rationality is only a part of the story of what we are. But the mystery of love is something that our rationality can never hope to comprehend. And in our politics, in our economics, in our technology and its applications, we need to use not just the rationality of the head, but also those values that come out of the beauty of the heart in the application of the hand of what we manage and what we make.
So we wind up saying, in effect, that the huge issues that we face, we can't stop addressing them. We can't hope to address them properly if we think of them as being out there. They, in a sense, are in here, right? But our hope is that by understanding them and growing beyond them, we can flower as human beings in a way that we might not have had we not had that test.
Absolutely, you've got it. And you know, Donald, we mustn't be too hard on ourselves. We are all complicit, we will all carry on being complicit. I've already said, you know, one of my sins, if you want to put it like that, is I'm addicted to eating meat. I don't much like vegetarian food. If anybody on my future route is hearing that, I love a bit of good meat, and yet I know the cost to the environment of that. I try to eat organic or free range, but you know, that's something that I am carrying. Now, I could beat myself up about it, but I think that there is a case for saying we have to accept ourselves as we are and not try to be everything and do everything. Otherwise, we just fall over our own hypocrisies. And that these are slow-moving things. Gradually, over time, the hard edges on us soften. And change comes about.
And one of the aspects of love is that we have to love ourselves, to some extent, warts and all, right?
Well, you see, Jesus didn't just say, love your neighbor. Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. What you mean by love of self, you don't mean pride, you don't mean hubris, you mean just saying, well, you know, I too am a human being with my needs and my failings and so on. My needs need to be served as well. I too need to earn my crust and all the rest of it. And seeking the fulfillment of your own needs in balance with recognizing those of others.
And when it comes down to actually what you're actually going to do tomorrow, kind of thing, I'm struck, as we've talked to so many people in these interviews, by how consistent the perception is about the actual steps to be taken, that you need to honor the feminine as well as the masculine,
yes.
That you need to be very local,
yes.
And you need to nurture things like that give access to your inner self, like the arts, for
yes.
example. I'm struck by the fact that you're a poet as well. These are very concrete things that you can do, and it's the same things, it seems to me, from everybody who thinks profoundly about these issues. They always come back to these same fundamental cores. And perhaps the real center of that is that all of those are about the inner life and your relationships with other people and with other forms of life.
Yes, but you see, not just that. If I can use my hand metaphor again, but this time make it the coquille Saint-Jacques, as the French call it, the scallop shell, the symbol of St. James, the symbol of pilgrimage. And the whole point of the scallop shell, and the reason why it stands as a symbol of pilgrimage, not just in the small sense of going on a long walk, but also in the great sense of our lives, is that we all come from different places, and we all converge to the hinge point on the scallop shell, if you like, to the gourd center, the gourd's place in that. But you don't just stay there. You then go home. You then walk out back into the outer life. So this is what it's about. It's about the in and the out, the breathing in and the breathing out, the taking what you need and the giving out to others on other paths.
And the final thing I wanted to ask you about is, it seems to me that all of this requires great courage, and that's one of the virtues that you cherish.
I think that courage, you know, it's been said by a number of wise thinkers that courage is the value that, without which all the others can be forgotten. And courage comes from the French coeur for heart, and the heart is a source of love. And so true courage is not about bravado. It's not about going and showing how strong you can be. True courage is about how deeply you can love. And that is the real journey of life. And all of us are really only taking feeble steps at the beginning of a very deep pilgrimage.
Alistair McIntosh, Scottish land reformer, human ecologist, and green theologian. If you enjoyed this interview, you may also want to see our interviews with Satish Kumar and David Orton. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.